All right, shut up. Was it? That's in the first 5 seconds of the recording. All right. So let's start talking about stuff. This is the class, right? Systems programming. All right. So for starters, well, the syllabus is up there. It's my usual grade breakdown, 10% for homework assignments. I'm also, there will be hackathons. I'm sorry, 10% for Bible homework. It'll be Bible homework plus other required things. So I think we're going to have 3 tech talks and probably 2 or 3 hackathons. This semester, I'll have all the dates for everything up by Friday, so you can ask time off of work. The hackathons will be much smaller time periods, like 4-hour hackathons instead of 12-hour hackathons. And I'm going to require at least most of those, or there'll be an alternate assignment if you were absolutely not able to attend. But that'll also be part of that 10% grade. We don't have very good participation of those things, so I'm just going to start requiring them. So, and I'll have all the dates up. You said you're going to have the dates Friday evening.
Hackathon Club's coming up with dates on Friday.
All right, so I'll have everything up by Saturday lunchtime. All right, let's see. And then normal homework assignments, 50% of your grade. And then exams is midterm and final, each worth 20. If you do better on the final, I'll replace your midterm exam score with it, yada, yada, yada. So any questions on the grading stuff? The usual thingy. Okay, so I assume everybody in here has had the operating systems class or has some sort of background in operating system. It's probably not necessarily absolutely critical you've had the class, but the next slide is going to ask a question. So, tell me, what's an operating system? Let's start with that guy. What is an operating system? Go ahead.
A program that controls how the system operates.
Okay. Give me some examples of operating systems.
Windows.
Nope. Keep going. We're at zero operating systems. This is a list of operating systems. Do a slide. List of operating systems. You said Windows. This is not NOS. What else? Go ahead. Linux. You want to add anything to that, or just want to say Linux?
I mean, I don't think it's Linux distributions, but just like.
Well, tell me about this distribution thing. What's a Linux distribution?
It's I would say an operating system, but like a different.
I mean, is there just one kind of Linux, or if I said go out and install Linux, what might you install?
I mean, I guess it depends.
Could be Ubuntu. You mentioned Raspbian a few minutes ago. Maybe SUSE Linux, Slackware. There's a zillion different Linux distributions out there. What does it mean for something to be a distribution? Good.
A type of the operating system.
Okay. Now we're back to a no now. Go ahead.
A distribution of like a variation on the operating system.
Okay. No. So here I'm gonna put Linux distribution here. And it'll say not an OS. Put it in parentheses here. So like Fedora, SUSE. Is it not gonna let me say SUSE? Ubuntu, etc. Also not an OS. Okay, let's just go ahead and throw. Now, what's funny about this? We'll go ahead and throw Mac OS out there. Not an OS. All right.
Would like the Linux kernel be considered an operating?
Ah, okay, so we have something called the Linux kernel. Now, what's the difference between a Linux distribution and this thing called the Linux kernel? He told us that an operating system, I'm sure it's the greatest definition yet, but is a piece of software that helps us communicate with the computer, right? Okay, I might say that it's a piece of software that sits between the human being and the hardware, because working with the hardware directly is kind of difficult, right? We're not going to be sitting there with like little metal prongs and, you know, completing circuits and that kind of stuff. So we're kind of reliant on this piece of software that makes using our computer hardware more convenient. All right. So what's the difference between the Linux kernel and, for example, Ubuntu Linux, one of our Linux distributions? Go ahead.
Is the Linux kernel the actual thing that like to the hardware, whereas like Linux distributions are like the GUI for it?
Okay, we're heading in the right direction now. So the Linux kernel, that's the actual OS. That's a single piece of software. It's a pretty complex piece of software. We're going to be spending the entire semester talking about stuff related to that. And then what these different Linux distributions do is they take that same core operating system and they package it with a whole bunch of starter applications. For example, maybe you have a couple of different GUI, graphic user interface things. You have a built-in word processor. Maybe you have some programming tools. When you download Raspbian for the first time, it already has a whole bunch of crap built into it, right? All right, so that's a distribution. Windows in and of itself is a distribution, right? When you install Windows, you get Notepad and 50 other things, right? You get a calculator, all that stuff. So what's the actual OS? Go ahead. Hey, whatever.
I was gonna say, like, the BIOS, is that like a film? I don't know if that's a film.
Okay, well, so you want to say BIOS. So BIOS is an operating system, right? So this is an OS. It's very, very simple OS, because all it's doing is handing off from the motherboard to the hard drive, which then launches your software-based operating system. And BIOS typically lives in firmware modernly. Historically, it would have been soldered into it, would have existed as its own chip. Go ahead.
So like the Windows kernel would be the actual like Windows OS?
Okay, so if we're operating off of Linux as our idea, we say Linux kernel, we kind of want to say Windows kernel. I'm going to say that's not going to cut it.
Windows 10 is a distribution.
Windows 10 is a distribution, but it's built on top of what operating system? Good. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. That's shockingly hot. Huh? And Mr. Gonzalez did. What you see? I don't know if I posted in general yet. Mr. Gonzalez has his own NFT now. He has two of them.
How expensive are they?
They're one of the last I checked, one of them had a bid of $250 on it from somebody who doesn't even know him. There's a bunch of bids for people who know him. They bid like $1 and stuff. It's ridiculous. People are just buying NFTs because for like no reason.
I don't understand it.
It is. Hey, I want to have one, but it's only it only exists once. Super rare. What's up?
I'm sorry for asking
No.
the wrong question, but what is it?
Non-fungible token. So think of it like Bitcoin, but different, but based on the same technology. Okay, so in any case, the BIOS is an operating system. Let's talk Windows. History of Microsoft OSs. All right, so you mentioned something called DOS. Okay, now at some point here, we're going to be splitting hairs, because when you originally downloaded, well, you didn't download, you went out and bought the 5 1/4-inch floppy disks for, DOS 1. It did run as a distribution. There is some minimum level of operating system that is compatible with human beings using the computer. But I would still make the argument that an OS what we've described from the Linux kernel is what the operating system actually is. And all of those extra pieces are part of the distribution. So realistically, I would say DOS is an operating system as well as a distribution. The operating system specific stuff is the OS part of it. And then the distribution is the fact that it comes with like edit, which is really, I think, about the only thing it came with. The original DOS came with a word processor that you typed edit in, and it launched this blue screen that was a text editor. And that was it. All right. So we'll say DOS is our first Microsoft operating system. All right. And then you had a bunch of releases of it: DOS 2, DOS 3, DOS 6.022, yada, yada, yada. So we had a whole bunch of DOSes. And then what's the next operating system from Microsoft? I want to see if did I start recording? Yeah, thank you. I think so. Am I? Yeah, but I'm not sure how the recording will work if I'm not sharing my screen. I don't know if it'll record my.
Probably just recording your face.
Huh?
Yeah, it's just,
I mean, it's all on the slide.
Yeah, that's gonna be good. Yeah, here, I'll just flip through the slides. Okay. All right. It's my birthday Thursday. I'm going to be 3. Last night I went out to dinner with a couple of friends, and I had a sash on that said "Birthday Princess." It was a pink sash, and I had a pink hat. So it was pretty good.
Where did you go?
Actually, that was a whole story. We tried to go out for pizza, and like every single pizza place is closed around here on Mondays because they can't find workers. So we ended up eating pizza at Charcoal Grill. Wasn't bad pizza actually, but when you're craving Chicago deep dish and you end up at Charcoal Grill, it's bad. It's not a good situation.
My town is open like 2 or 3 days a week. No work.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. I
Whenever
can't.
I go to Starbucks, it's just like someone like mentioned that to me.
Well, I mean, you can make
Like one of
more.
my coworkers over break mentioned that to me.
Isn't the government handout now like $16 an hour? Oh, to what? Really? Wow. So you can almost decide to work here instead of McDonald's.
Yeah.
I mean, not quite, but almost. Almost. All right. History of Microsoft OSs. So we have DOS. What was the next operating system you're aware of that came out from, or at least let's say the next distribution that came out from Microsoft? Go ahead.
DOS and MS-DOS.
Yeah. Actually, if we want to be technical about it, MS-DOS was probably the original release of DOS from Microsoft. When DOS existed prior to Microsoft, because Bill Gates bought it from somebody after he went into IBM and said, hey, we want to license you our operating system, and IBM agreed to it, but they didn't actually have an operating system. Kind of where Microsoft became rich. It was probably one of the most lucrative meetings in history. All right, what's the next distribution we're aware of? Go ahead.
Windows 1.
Windows 1, probably a true statement. So we'll say Windows. We'll say Windows 1, Windows 2. So the first one that meant something, let's see, is Windows 3.1.
Yeah, that was like the first big one. Like one sort of happened. And I remember I didn't really get anywhere.
So what did Windows 3.1 bring to the table that DOS didn't have? Graphic user interface. All right, what's our next one? Go ahead. Windows 95. Okay, what did Windows 95 bring to the table that Windows 3.1 didn't have? No. Multitasking. Something we take for granted today, right? Having more than one application open at once. How many of you had actually, this is probably a bad question now since it's been around for a long time. Anybody in here have the original iPhone? When the original iPhone came out, it didn't have multitasking. You know, you could have one app open at once. You could, if you wanted Pandora open, you can't check your email. That's the deal. Now you flip between apps all over the place and stuff like that. The original Android operating system, which came out about 1.5 years after the first iOS, it had multitasking and also had full 3 minutes of battery life. Related to that problem of multitasking. We'll talk about that in here. This class is effectively about all that crap that happens behind the scenes and programming for it. So Windows 95 brought us this new user interface. It brought us the advent of the start menu, right? The little start button, you know, that everybody wants, although that's gone in Windows 11, sort of. Right now they got the little thing on the bottom that sort of kind of still has a start button on the left side of it, but we want it on the bottom left. Wrong place. That's they broke it.
I wonder if they changed up the like basic UI thing you had that took a long time. Like to move it.
Probably not.
It looks more like Apple.
Yeah, it looks more like Apple, but I mean,
That's not why I want Windows.
but at the end of the day, I mean, this is kind of the weird thing with Apple, or the funny thing with Apple is, I mean, I'm a Mac user, but because I use the single operating system for all the different operating systems, I mean, I do prefer Mac for its Unix capabilities. I do a lot of stuff on the terminal. But if I were going to put Grandpa down in front of a computer, and I had a choice between putting him down in front of Windows 95 or the current modern day Mac, I'd put him down on Windows 95. Where do you start? At the start button. Start button tells you where to start. With a Mac, you barely know how to get to your applications. You got to start digging around. I don't think Macs are all that user friendly. Good.
And I was gonna say, I mean, I thought Windows 10 was gonna be like the end of it. And Windows came out with it.
Why would there ever be an end of it when they could just charge you $150 more for the next one? Doesn't make any sense.
Forget I said that.
You gotta be careful what questions you ask. Some of them just gonna like really tell you why you're wrong.
You know what? I'm used to him grilling me and telling me this stuff less. I think I can.
I mean, I mean, everybody's about making money, right?
Yeah.
So why stop at Windows 10 when we can charge you for Windows 11?
I just thought they were gonna keep updating the operating system, because they were pushing Windows 10.
Because they're new version, they can sell it to you and they want you to buy it.
Yeah, it's all about the money.
I mean, they could have done a subscription, but I think this was probably better than having a subscription.
Well, here's my latest conspiracy theory. And this is kind of funny. Some of you know I was sick at the very end of last semester. I had shingles. And I'm supposed to be too young to get shingles. It's from the chicken pox virus. Most of you never had chicken pox, but when I was a kid, there wasn't a vaccine for chicken pox. So I had chicken pox, and then it stays in your system. And sometimes that turns into shingles later on in life, which sucked. It's super painful. You don't want it. But here's where it gets funny. This is a conspiracy thing. I don't necessarily believe it, but it wouldn't surprise me. I mentioned to my dad that I had shingles, and he said, he was talking to his doctor, and his doctor's not an anti-vax person or anything. His doctor said, you know what, I've seen an uptick in my patients who've had the vaccine who also have had shingles. It's like, oh, okay. Well, so I did a Google search, and there's like 2 or 3 different research groups who are specifically looking for correlations between the Pfizer vaccine and shingles. Now, they all concluded that there isn't a correlation, but the fact that they were asking the question in the first place, I found interesting. But this was the kicker. This is what I was laughing out loud for a while. This is like 3 weeks ago. I saw a news story. Pfizer and BioNTech, the company they worked with to make their Pfizer COVID vaccine, are getting ready to release a shingles vaccine. so now you start thinking of capitalism at work. So let's kind of give them shingles. We'll solve it later. I mean, you don't die from shingles. You're just in torture. So it's all for the buck. I don't think that's probably what went down, but it is kind of funny that you follow the breadcrumbs. All right, back to multitasking. We're 20 minutes into class. We're off topic 35 times. All That's right. Okay, so Windows 95 brought multitasking, something we take for granted today. We expect 30 applications to be open on our machine at once now. What came after Windows 95? Go ahead.
Either Windows 2000 or Windows.
Okay,
Maybe it's the first or cheaper.
Windows NT 3.51. Well, now we start getting, this kind of becomes interesting. Windows NT and 3.51 is kind of like the first one that mattered. You know, it had some earlier renditions of it. What was special about Windows? And actually, hold on a second. These are technically a little bit out of order. Windows NT 3.51 came out before Windows 95. So what was the difference between Windows 3.1 and Windows NT? This guy is actually where multitasking was introduced. So Windows NT 3.51 had the graphic user interface of Windows 3.1, but allowed multitasking. Then Windows 95 came out and supported multitasking with a brand new GUI. This is start menu. But this is where we saw our branch off here. Windows 3.1 was based on DOS. The underlying operating system was DOS. And then the distribution was called Windows 3.1, and it had a bunch of software packaged with it, including a GUI. And like what Emily mentioned, these Linux distributions kind of do. Windows NT 3.51 was based on the NT kernel. This was Microsoft's first real operating system, the operating system that they made. NT, anybody know what NT stands for? New technology. Okay, so NT stands for new technology. All right, so DOS, let's just kind of put this on a different slide just for organizational purposes. Actually, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do this. I'm going to come back and steal that here in a second. So this is the business OSs. This is the consumer OSs. Now, up to Windows 3.1, all the OSs were both consumer and business. In fact, there was a operating system called Windows 3.11, Windows for Workgroups, which was the first version of Windows 3.1 that supported local area networks. This is kind of it was evolving with what was happening with networking. Internet wasn't quite there yet, but local networks were where you might share a printer and that kind of stuff. But right here is where Microsoft branched. They came out with Windows NT 3.51, which was based on a new operating system, not compatible with DOS. Two different operating systems. All right. The upgrade to Windows 3.1 on the consumer side was actually Windows 95. What came out next after Windows 95? Go ahead. Windows NT 4.0. What did this bring? You're going to be right here in a second. What did Windows NT 4.0 bring? Probably still built on top of the NT kernel. The whole NT 4.0 thing kind of gives it away, right? Go ahead. the Windows 95 GUI. So the Windows 95 GUI, the start menu thing, was a big hit. So NT4 brought that good user interface over to the new core operating system that supported multitasking, was more stable, things like that, built for businesses. What came next? Windows 98. What did Windows 98 bring? Now we're starting to get to a little bit more of incremental changes. So I'm going to call this guy real plug and play. But really that existed in Windows 95. But let's just try to put something there. It kind of much more driver support. All right. Still based on DOS. What came after Windows 98? Go ahead. You're skipping one. So you'll be right in a minute again. Go ahead. You're gonna be right in a little bit soon. Yeah, Windows Millennium isn't next on the list, but it is one that we're gonna put on the list, and then we're gonna badmouth it and stuff. So Windows 2000. What did this guy bring? To this day, Windows 2000 is still one of the most popular operating systems that's ever existed. There's still businesses that are running it today. But there's a little bit of a problem here. Go ahead. Yep. I just said, what's the problem here? It should be on the business side of this list because it's based on the NT kernel. Now this becomes a little bit of a, back in these days, people were shopping for their operating systems at like Best Buy. So if you're currently running Windows 98 at home and you walk into Best Buy and you see Windows 2000, first thing that pops into your head is, oh, upgrade to my Windows 98. A lot of people went and bought Windows 2000, brought it home, upgraded their Windows 98 to Windows 2000. The upgrade worked. Okay, but what's the problem now? They got a really stable operating system, so they're not going to have to reboot their computer very often. The blue screen of death is going to happen less often, but all their games broke. There's no software drivers on the business thing for your joysticks and some of the early graphics cards, stuff like that. It wasn't meant to be consumer focused. It was meant to be business focused. Well, so why did Microsoft, just being Microsoft, why did they mess up their naming convention? They could have called it NT5. But instead, they kind of used a misleading convention over here, calling it Windows 2000, but it actually is based on the NT kernel. That's a problem. What came next? Windows Millennium. Windows ME. Okay. Now, anybody know something funny that happened with Windows ME? This is related to Dell Microsystems. It's a kind of a funny time. Go ahead. Let's say probably everything broke with Windows Millennium. So you would buy a new computer from Dell and it would ship with the latest consumer operating system, right? Ship with Windows Millennium. Dell was then offering upgrades back to Windows 98 for free. We can send you the disk to you so you can go back to an operating system that worked. So we're going to call this the death of the consumer OS. Because what operating system came next? Go ahead. Windows XP. And what did Windows XP bring to the table? What's good about the business operating systems? Stability. You know, they run for a while. You don't get too many blue screens of death, stuff like that. What's good about the consumer operating systems? Compatibility with third-party hardware, things like that. So what do you think Windows XP did? brought them together. Consumer driver support with stability of the NT kernel. All right, and then the rest is kind of history. What came after Windows XP? Windows Vista. Okay, what did Windows Vista bring to the table? Now, who at this point in time, you know, we had really 3 operating systems that were being used, right? So you had Microsoft's operating systems, you had Apple's operating systems. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes. And then you had Linux, all right? In terms of a percentage, what percentage of computer users ran some flavor of Windows? Really, really, really high, right? 96, 97%. And that's probably being kind at certain time periods. All right. So if you're a unethical computer scientist and you write viruses, okay, you know, you're writing viruses to attack other people's computers, you know, mess with people, right? Are you going to mess with the 3 people running the Mac OS, or are you going to mess with the 4 zillion people running Windows? Microsoft had a big target, right? Okay, so you know, you've probably heard at some point in time people make the claim that, oh, well, you know, Windows can get viruses, my Mac can't get viruses. You've heard somebody claim that at some point. Okay. Yeah, could we say that the modern day Mac is a little bit more secure than Windows? Probably, but it's not because of anything Apple did, because it's based on Unix. But let's call it marginally more secure. Heck, Microsoft has more active development in their security patches than Apple does at the Unix side of things. So we can call them relatively similar. But certainly back then, Microsoft had a huge target on its back. So if you were writing viruses, you were going to target Windows. So what did Vista bring to the table? Okay. Yeah. Oh, you had another question? Yeah, we'll talk about it. Think of Unix and Linux as the same thing. Yeah, Linux is the open source version of Unix. So Windows Vista brought a suite of security stuff at the cost of convenience. So back during this time, again, maybe you weren't necessarily seeing these commercials based on your age, but maybe you've seen some of them on like the history YouTube video or something like that. You had those videos like, hi, I'm a Mac, I'm a PC. You heard of those videos before? And so you'd have like the Mac, it was an Apple commercial. So you had the Mac guy, he was all cool and stuff. And then you had the PC guy. And during when Vista came out, the PC guy had like 2 special agents standing behind him, and every single time you wanted to do anything, like, you wanted to open Microsoft Word, it would like, are you sure you want to do that? It's like you had to click OK 6 times before you could do anything on your computer. That was kind of the deal. So, go back at some point and watch the YouTube videos of hi, I'm a Mac, I'm a PC, the commercials. They were pretty funny. Some of the old Android versus iOS ones were funny too. So in any case, Windows Vista, we would call an extremely secure operating system at the cost of being pretty inconvenient. So I think a lot of users did not like Vista because it was annoying to use. But in terms of the quality of the OS, nothing wrong with Vista. What came after Vista? Go ahead. Okay, so Windows 7. Call this guy Fixed Vista. And then let's just put some dots here, because now we start splitting into, we had like, Windows Server 2010, things like that, where they were all based on NT. They were just putting more software packages on it. So everything over in this right side is NT based, and all modern Microsoft operating systems are built on top of their NT kernel, the consumer kernel. Now, right around in a later update, so I think at the time this was called in Service Pack 2. DOS got renamed to the 9X kernel. They were actually emulating DOS in there. So they sort of kind of updated that kernel, but it was still a DOS compatible kernel, but they called it the 9X kernel. So that was the actual operating system. Go ahead. It was. Yeah. Yeah, all these were. Yeah. But I mean, it's not really inaccurate to say it was based on DOS. This was really more of a behind the scenes naming convention. They did change something with it because your command prompt was emulating DOS at some point. So there was something they changed in it where it was not running native DOS anymore. Because when Windows 95 first came out, well, if you already had Windows 3.1 installed, you were fine. But when it first came out, I'm pretty sure if you were putting it on a blank machine, you had to install DOS 6.2, or actually with DOS 7 at the time first, and then you would upgrade that to Windows 95. Pretty quickly, that wasn't the case. It came with the DOS installer as part of it, but there was a period of time where you had to do both. I remember originally installing Windows 3.1. It just was just a box of disks, you know, because you're putting floppy disks in to install it. It was a 3.5 inch disk at that time. So, you know, normal, what you would consider a historical floppy disk. You know, it's like, please enter disk 14. I remember when I was, so I started programming when I was 9, and I grew up in Champaign, Illinois, and which is, well, I grew up just outside of Champaign. So that's where that's where University of Illinois is. And more interestingly, it's where the National Center for Supercomputing Applications is, NCSA. So they had one of the few internet connections relatively early because they were part of the research group for it. Kind of our first graphical web browser was something called Mosaic. So I'm this kid in the lab, and I was I'm guessing I was one of the first 20 people to ever use Mosaic, because I mean, I was, you know, this kid, my mom would drop me off at the computer lab, and I'd come in with just my box of disks so I can install in whatever computer I was in to write my software and stuff like that. So all these, you know, the guys who are, you know, the university researchers who are working on this, you know, they would come and like, I was cool because I hung out with them, the geeks, I guess. Well, so they let me try their software. So it's kind of like my interesting backstory, but I remember, you know, I had my backpack and I'd come in and I started unpacking stuff. I just have these boxes of floppy disks sitting next to these computers, and, you know, I'm gonna install, you know, the basic interpreter, basic compiler, I guess at that time, on the machines. You know, it's kind of funny how far we've come, where now our computers don't even have disk drives. It's like hard to find one that has a disk drive. Sure. History of Mac OSs. All right. So what was the very early Mac OS based on? What did Macs run at the beginning? And actually, let's call these guys Apple OSs. Because really, when we say Apple and we say Mac, where did Mac come from? What happened at Apple that created, because if you bought a computer when Apple first came out, it was an Apple computer, like the Apple IIc, Apple IIe computer. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I remember right, they got a computer that was called a Macintosh.
Yeah, the first one was called the Macintosh Lisa.
Yeah, that's
And so what Apple did is inside the company, they created two competing teams. You had the Apple group and you had the Macintosh group. And the Macintosh group were the ones working on an operating system with a graphic user interface. The Apple group were still running their old operating system. What operating system was that? DOS. All right. In the early days, Apple and Microsoft were in cahoots, right? Because Apple started off as a hardware company. Wozniak was like a hardware guy. You know, Steve Jobs was the salesman. Not that he was stupid, but he was the face of the business. Wozniak was maybe kind of the brains, the technical know-how kind of guy. But they still needed an operating system to run on their computer to make it usable if you wanted consumers to be able to use it. Before that, the people who used an Apple computer were like the geeks, right? You know, you've seen, you know, they still sell, if you go online, like on eBay, you can find Apple One computers. They still sell for like 150 grand, you know, and it's just like a circuit board inside of a box that, you know, doesn't really have an OS. It's like whatever you would consider is the most basic version of a computer. You know, that's what that was, but that's not consumer ready. That's like geek ready, right? You'd come home and you'd have your Apple One kit. And you would build your computer and you needed a soldering iron, the whole rigmarole. So in the early days, Apple was running DOS because what Microsoft was doing is Microsoft kind of created the world of licensing software. Kind of a famous quote during that meeting with Steve Jobs and a couple other Microsoft guys in the IBM dudes, because IBM was the cool kid back then. They were the ones, you know, they were the big tech company. IBM's still a big company, but they're no longer, you know, they're the old, they're, you know, they sleep in three-piece suits, right? You know, at IBM, that type of thing. But that original meeting, even though Microsoft didn't have an operating system at the time, which is more of the ha-ha thing, but that original meeting is Microsoft said, hey, we want to license you our operating system on a per machine basis. This is right at the very beginning of consumer-based PCs. You know, before that, Microsoft was IBM, sorry, was creating mainframes and things like that for big businesses. Okay, but now this idea of having machines for the everyday consumer was starting to become a reality, and IBM was thinking, hey, we'd like to play, but you know, you don't want to take too big of a risk. You don't want to have to, you know, keep your costs down. So now I got a company sitting in front of me that says, look, if you sell a machine, then you give us our cut, our license for it. You don't sell a machine, we don't get anything. Sounds like a pretty good deal, right? What did IBM say? They said, no problem. The real money's in the hardware. Kind of backfired on them, but you know, that's that Microsoft made its zillions on that concept, licensing software. Okay, and that's why there'll always be a new version of Windows. Forever, until desktop computing just disappears. You know, and then Microsoft will find something else to license. That's why they keep buying up the video game companies now. Because they've kind of lost the war in mobile.
Did they also try to make a phone?
Oh, sure.
Windows Phone the last time?
They didn't. Yeah, they had it was called Windows CE.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah, so they did. They had a
I
mobile,
remember that.
and it wasn't horrible.
I remember it just didn't take off at all.
Yeah, my wife had a Windows phone. She liked it. Same thing. A lot of people preferred the Microsoft Zune over the iPod. But the iPod was already at version 6 and was so far ahead of the crowd, and people had iPod everything. So it died, didn't make it. You know, they have a flashback to the Zune in the Guardians of the Galaxy movie. They had the zillion songs on it. But yeah, so in the early days of Apple took their hardware and married it to Microsoft's operating system. Okay, so this was the DOS operating system, we can say, ran on Apple computers. And there were several different Apple computers running different renditions of the DOS operating system. And this is where things got kind of interesting, is anybody heard of a company called Xerox? Who's Xerox? What do they do? Printers, copy machines. Okay, well, Xerox, just like I mentioned, IBM was big into, you know, they thought, hey, let's jump onto this this consumer computer bandwagon. But then they decided, you know what, forget this. The real money is in printers. and copy machines. They've done all right, right? But their engineers were working on a graphical user interface operating system for a computer that was going to be called the Xerox Star. I think it had some other code names and stuff, but so they scrapped the project, invited because Apple was friends with this company at some level, invited the Apple engineers in. So imagine you're this engineer at Xerox who just, put all their blood and sweat into creating this, brand new graphic user interface thing. And you just bring in Apple engineers. You're just telling them everything. Didn't even sell it to them. Say here. This is a washed up project. So then Apple turned around and released their Macintosh line to finish developing that GUI user interface, and that came out on their Macintosh computer. So any computer that was called a Mac had a graphic user interface in it. And you can actually go back and watch the keynote when Apple was announcing the original Macintosh. Steve Jobs is on stage, he's announcing it, and while he's on stage, he got like a notification on the wireless radio signals that machines were being shipped in, I think it was over in China, definitely overseas somewhere, running a graphic user interface version of Windows. Microsoft was, stole their crap. But is it really stealing? If I don't know. Xerox gave it to Apple, Microsoft stole it from Apple, whatever. It all worked out in the end, right? So then there was some bad blood between Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, but that's all history. So you had, Mac OS 6, 7, 8, 9. Let's kind of expedite that list. Okay, really interesting naming conventions Apple used back then. It was inventive, all those things. So in any case, you had all these, and these were Apple created OSs based originally on the Xerox technology. And there were earlier ones than Mac OS 6, but Mac OS 6 was the first one that I guess you would consider to be a main, kind of like Windows 3.1, mainstream GUI operating system. Go ahead. Neither.
Okay.
Yeah, they were their own thing. All right, so somewhere in the Mac OS 7 to 8 time period, Steve Jobs gets canned by Apple, right? Kind of the funny backstory there. And there's tons of movies you can go out and watch that kind of tell the history of Apple. So you could watch this in cinema. It's pretty entertaining stuff. But Apple, Steve Jobs went to the CEO of Pepsi and say, do you want to change the world? Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? That's pretty close to a quote. He said something along those lines. So he came over, became the head of the board for Apple because Steve Jobs was working very heavily with the Macintosh team. And then that guy turned around and basically turned the board on Steve Jobs and got him fired from his own company. Publicly traded company. You can get fired from it. So Steve Jobs gets fired. What did he do while he was fired from Apple? There was a period of time there, probably something like 4 years-ish. I might be making that up, but something like that. Was he just twiddling his thumbs? Yeah.
Also during that time period.
He must have been doing something. Well, for starters, he bought a film company. His George Lucas, the Star Wars guy, was going through a divorce, needed some cash, so offloaded a little company you probably haven't heard of called Pixar. So Steve Jobs bought Pixar for something like $7 million or something like that, and turned around years later and sold it to Disney for something like $7 billion, and still was the head of the board. That's a pretty good investment. Almost as good as Mr. Gonzalez's NFT is going to be. I'm probably gonna get back to my office. It's gonna be like at $700. They're gonna be talking about on Jimmy Fallon. So in any case, he went and did a couple things, founded bought Pixar for George Lucas. But he worked on a computing company called Next Computers. So there you go. There's Steve Jobs there. There's Next Computers. Okay, so Next Computers, at this point in time, from an operating system point of view, it was very much Microsoft versus Apple. And Macs couldn't run, like if you had a floppy disk that was formatted for the Mac and you put it into a Windows machine, it would say, hey, you need to format this disk, and vice versa. So you couldn't move files between the two machines. Next Computers looked to solve that problem as just a starting point. But they also were based on top of the Unix operating system. They really targeted education. They were expensive, but they actually did all right in the education world. Well, then Apple almost failed as a company. Why did they almost fail? What made Apple start to fall apart? How many of you dislike Apple? Gotta have several of you in here, right? It's polarizing, just like anything else. Okay. Yeah, but what are some reasons why people don't like Apple? Expensive, right? Go ahead.
I think in the hardware, or if I go into the hardware,
Okay, inflexible, right? Okay. A lot of people don't like the fact that it's proprietary.
The right repair stuff, like, you can't repair it.
Yeah, can't repair it. You got to send it to Apple. Apple's going to charge you top dollar or whatever, right? Okay. But so that proprietary nature, people don't like. We view proprietary as being a bad thing. Is that a true statement? We think that that word means I don't want anything to do with it. Well, there was pressure on Apple to become less proprietary, and they took advantage of it. So you, just like you had PCs where they were called IBM compatible PCs. So they all ran Windows, but they weren't made by Microsoft. They were made by a zillion other companies. They started allowing there to be Mac clones. So these were computers not made by Apple that could run the Macintosh operating systems. Well, Apple makes a lot of money off the fact that they rate their software and their hardware, and they control both sides of the coin. And as soon as they gave that part of their business away, they started falling apart as a company. Apple's secret sauce is the fact that they're proprietary. You don't have to like them. You just have to be drinking the Kool-Aid and swipe a credit card. Nothing wrong with it. They are what they are, right? You know, you could say you're a Microsoft fan, but it's not like they're, you know, all dollars and roses, I guess. You know, they're Microsoft, they'll go and steal software from somebody, then they get sued and they settle outside of court, and you know, everybody's happy. It's just the way big companies work. I mean, but really Apple made a mistake. They tried to become what was working on with the competition, when actually it was what used to work for them. So then what did Apple do? Did they hire Steve Jobs again? Nope. Apple never actually hired Steve Jobs. What did they do? Go ahead. Yeah, they acquired Next Computers, which comes with its CEO, Steve Jobs, who they then installed as the interim CEO at Apple, the I CEO. Steve Jobs paid a lot of Apple's bills as it was bleeding out cash to keep it afloat. And then he came out with a couple of hits, right? You know, he had the iPod, the iMac, the iBook. There was a laptop that you had like had a big own carrying handle. I wonder why that went away. Those were actually really good. That clamshell thing. Yeah, it was really good. Look at this. Look at this thing. Yeah, like this, that guy. What's wrong with that? What's up? Oh, I don't know. They were pretty popular. People had those.
so laughing at all of that. Not out of all seriousness. You look at it very helpful.
Chances are with some sort of crazy proprietary hinge, you know, the hinge cracks, you got to take out a second mortgage on your car. Just like several years ago, Apple came out with a new monitor, but it didn't come with a stand.
$1,000.
It was like $1,000. Yeah, it was like crazy expensive for the stand. It's like, yo, you want to put,
Like $8,000.
yeah, you want to put this on your desk?
The wheels of the Mac Pro? Yeah, that's the thing. That's all the wheels separately for the Mac Pro. What was that?
I think that was a joke.
Was that?
Yeah, there was like a spoof video when the Mac Pro originally came out where they,
No,
yeah.
the wheels fit. There's the wheels fit on Apple's website.
okay. Well, at some point there was a joke. There was a joke along those lines where, you know, this guy is like, he has this like perfectly packaged, it's like, you know, made from 130% recycled material, you know, stuff like that. Yeah.
$700 for.
Yeah. Well, maybe I might be talking about something even older than that. So Apple finally made it a reality, you know, but there was, you know, this video where this guy's like unpacking something that was like something so trivial, and but he's like taking it out, like, you know, basically a clean room. It was, it was kind of ridiculous. All right. So in any case, Steve Jobs comes back, has a couple of hits, right? iPod, iMac, all these guys, yada, yada, yada. Now, this is kind of where things get interesting, again, from an operating system perspective, which is what our focus is. So I'm not going to ask you questions about this, you know, these history sub-stories and stuff. These are interesting stuff, important for us to kind of appreciate how we got here, but the focus in here is things involving the operating systems themselves. All right. But up to this point, all of the, well, in the early days, all the Apple computers ran on top of the Intel processor. Okay. Now, then Apple started working with IBM on their own processors because, you know, they can't be using the same hardware as the Microsoft stuff people are, right? So what were the processors for, called for the Macintosh computers for a long time? What was the architecture? Go ahead. Well, that's now. That's a new thing. Yeah. So actually, Apple's flip flopped a bunch of times. So I mean, that's not I mean, it's a very out of order answer, but it's not an incorrect answer. So Apple ran a architecture called PowerPC, which was made by IBM. And then they had the PowerPC. They had the G3 processor. The PowerPC CPU, made by IBM, this guy right here. All right. Then we had the PowerPC G3. Okay, so here, oh yeah, here's your G3 Mac Pro. And those were so awesome. Okay. But then they came out with the G4. The G4 was a gray case. This guy, look at that. Okay, and the commercials for the G4 had like multiple tanks. You know, it's like this was the first technically supercomputer with so many teraflops of computing power or something like that. And then they had the dual processor G4s. Okay, it wasn't multi-core, single core processors, but there was two of them. All right, now, but what was funny with that, because that's when, you know, they were saying two brains is better than one, yada, yada, yada. And this came out when it was Mac OS 9. The problem was Mac OS 9, that operating system, didn't support multiple processors. So you're sitting there with this expensive Mac with two G4 processors in it, PowerPC G4 processors, and you can only use one of them. The second processor sort of kind of could be taken advantage of with some applications like Photoshop. They had some like secondary code that would allow the second processor to be used, but the operating system didn't natively work with it. Yeah, look at this. Man, it was so awesome. Look at the size of the heatsink. This is when there was just one. So in any case, these were PowerPC processors not compatible with the architecture that's Intel. All right, these guys were RISC architecture, which, you know, were hard to produce at the time. What's funny is now RISC is where things are going with the ARM processors. Those are all RISC-based processor, reduced instruction set. M1 is a reduced instruction set. Okay, so Apple went from using these IBM chips, which were very expensive and they were having a lot of failures, and then decided, hey, we're going to switch to Intel. Because Intel was the popular CPU brand, right? That this time they were probably on the Pentium 3, maybe? Ballparky, something like that. Pentium 2, Pentium 3. Very successful. Now, remind me, what does a compiler do? Go ahead. Converts high level code to low level code. All right. Remind me about low level code. What is that? Go ahead. Not quite machine code. You have binary, you have high level. What's the guy in the middle? What does that look like? Okay, so a one-to-one relationship with the CPU. Okay, so the question is, so this is a one-to-one relationship with the CPU. Typically we call this assembly language, right? Would Intel and PowerPC assembly look the same? Two different architectures. Remember, we talked about a CPU is a collection of magic tricks. An Intel CPU has this list of magic tricks. A PowerPC CPU has this list of magic tricks. I made it a little bit smaller because the idea was it's a reduced instruction set. Okay. The idea was they gave you the correct magic tricks to solve the same kinds of problems, general purpose computer problem thingies. Okay. But these are different architectures, different assembly language, which means that any software that you, so back to this compiler thing, compiler converts high level code to low level code. When compiling, what needs to be considered? So we have the target architecture. So I386, PowerPC, MIPS, etc. Okay, what else? Remember this slide, or we've seen this before, hopefully in several of my classes, right? That guy? So this is I386 assembly. All right. So when you compile something, it's going to take your high level language, maybe C, C++, and it's going to turn it into this. This is the hello world program, right? What time is this class over? 50? Okay. So it's going to turn it into something like this. This is low level code. Specifically, this is low level code that runs on Intel. All right. But this guy, if you remember how this is working, we're printing out hello world here. So we have the length of hello world. We have the pointer to the beginning of the actual string. We're putting a 1 in here, which says, where are we writing it out to? We're putting a 4 in here. This is which system call. We're going to be using system calls a lot in this class. So what system call are we taking advantage of here? So we just load 4 pieces of information. We put them in 4 different boxes. And then we call upon the kernel, that guy. We've introduced, that's what the operating system is, right? That's called the kernel. So we call the kernel. The kernel says, okay, I'm going to go look right here. That's what you want to do. You want to do a syswrite. Okay, well, I need to know, where do you want to write it? What am I writing and how long is it? So this is the base address, and this is how far I need to go from that base address to get all the characters you want me to write out. And then it just goes and does it. So what did we need to do? The compiler that produced this output from a high level program. It needed to know the architecture. So it wrote out I386 assembly, right? What else did it need to know about? What's this guy? It's just right there. That's a system call for what? Linux. It's the Linux kernel that knows about syswrite. Now, does the NT kernel have kind of an equivalent to syswrite? It has something that lets you kind of display crap to the screen. Okay, but syswrite, this specific one, is something that's part of the system calls for Linux. So a compiler needs to know about the target architecture. It also needs to know about the target OS. It needs both of these so that it can create the appropriate assembly code and take advantage of the native system calls of the underlying OS. Does that make sense? So the difference between Mac and Windows software, it's going to be a little bit dependent on the time, but if we're talking about the software that was running on Windows at the time, so let's say that's kind of the Windows 98 years, ballparky. Okay, so if you had Windows programs, Windows 98 program, let's say, this guy targeted I386. So this is Intel architecture. And targeted the 9X kernel. Mac OS 6 through 9 program targeted PowerPC RISC architecture. And targeted the Mac OS kernel. What does this mean? The software for Windows would not run on a Mac and vice versa. Make sense? Okay, you got your executable, it was compiled for the other guy. It's not going to work over here on this guy because it's the wrong architecture and it's the wrong operating system. It's doubly broken. Okay, it's calling magic tricks this dude doesn't even know about. And even if it knew about it, it's calling system calls that don't exist. Make sense? So we have incompatibility between the two. That doesn't surprise any of us, does it? We kind of expect those guys to be incompatible. But this is where things get interesting with Apple. So when Steve Jobs comes back, he decides, he makes the executive decision, let's say, that we're going to go ahead. Well, first of all, he released their next operating system was Mac OS X. This is all related to what we're talking about here. All right, so Mac OS X. And there was a question, does the X stand for 10 or does it stand for the X in Unix? It was actually based on top of OpenBSD Unix, which is a proprietary Linux operating system, let's say. So Mac OS X, the original version of Mac OS X, ran on PowerPC. So that means that the target architecture was still PowerPC, but the target operating system was now a Unix-based operating system, which means that the Mac software that used to run in your Mac OS 9 machine yesterday no longer works on your machine today. So you go out and you buy the latest, greatest Mac OS X, you come home, you upgrade your Mac that was running Mac OS 9, you upgrade it to Mac OS X and nothing works anymore. All your software is broken. No problem, because it's easily fixable. Spend more money. Let's go buy software again, right? Okay, but that was delayed because people didn't have the software ready yet, because Apple's so protective of everything, they didn't even know how incompatible stuff was going to be. So Apple actually released Mac OS X with a piece of software called Blue Box, which was a virtual machine running Mac OS 9. So any software that you had that used to run in your Mac OS 9 that now won't run natively on your Mac OS X, you would run in Blue Box at, I don't know, let's call it a 20th of the speed. Crappy performance, but technically worked. All right. So then some time went by, and finally the software companies started, they ported their software over to Mac OS X. Some of it, I mean, it's not just as easy always as just recompiling with graphical applications. You know, they might have had to make some changes to do things in a little bit different way, but ultimately they had to compile it again, make some changes, ultimately targeting still the PowerPC architecture, but now targeting a different operating system, the Mac OS X operating system. Okay, keeping in mind, we also needed a compiler that knew about the Mac OS X architecture. So you had to kind of wait for that, or Mac OS X operating system. So that was a time period, it's called a year or so, where Mac people had a bunch of broken software that was running in an emulated slow version, virtualized slow version. And then finally, now they can run everything at full speed. All their software is working, right? Things are great, okay? What did Steve Jobs do then? We finally, we went through this rough time. We took this big risk switching operating systems. Hey, Mac OS X is better. It's a better operating system than Mac OS 9 ever was, for all sorts of reasons. Okay, but we had this time period where none of your software worked, and it's a rough time for Apple. So as soon as they got out of the woods with that, Steve Jobs goes and says, you know what? Let's switch to Intel. So they came out with, I think it was version 2 of Mac OS X, but whatever. You know, pick a cat, your favorite cat, panther, tiger, lion, you know, whatever. So one of the Mac OS X's, and now this guy is for the Intel processor. So what happened again? All your software is broken. Because that software that they just finished updating is now what? It's targeting the PowerPC architecture for the Mac OS X operating system. But you now need it for the Intel architecture for the Mac OS X operating system. Make sense? So now we have another, let's call it a year time period, where they have to release the software again. Okay. And they survived it again. And that's where we are today. Your Mac, well, almost where we are today. Up until last year, a year and a half ago, I guess now, Mac OS X or Mac was running Intel. Now they're releasing their own silicon, the M1 processor, the M1 Pro, M1 Max. All right. So I'm just going to put a start here thing. Let's see. So we're going to say PowerPC to Intel back to M1. That's where I'll pick up on Thursday. Questions, comments, concerns, bribes? All right. I'll see everybody on Thursday.